My son left me standing at the departure's entrance of Istanbul Ataturk with one carry-on bag, $43 in my wallet, and no return ticket in my name. He didn't look back. I watched his rental car merge into traffic, and I thought, not for the first time, but for the last time, that I had fundamentally misread who my son was. I was 61 years old. I was standing on foreign soil. My phone had 4% battery. And somewhere behind the sliding glass doors of that terminal, a woman I had never met was about to change the entire remaining arc of my life. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Because before you understand what happened next, you need to understand how I ended up on that curb in the first place, and exactly what my son believed about me when he drove away. He believed I was finished. That I was old, dependent, broke, and without options. He believed that leaving me there would be an inconvenience, embarrassing, maybe, but ultimately something I would absorb quietly, the way I had absorbed every other humiliation he had handed me over the previous 4 years. He was catastrophically wrong. My name is Gerald Osei. I spent 31 years as a structural engineer before I retired at 58. I owned my home outright. I had savings, investments, and a pension that paid me more monthly than most people my son's age earned working full-time. I was not a man who needed rescuing. But my son, Kofi, had decided somewhere along the way that I was a burden. And once a person decides that about you, they stop seeing what's actually in front of them. They see the story they've already written. And in Kofi's version of the story, I was the old man who needed to be managed, tolerated, and eventually discarded. The Istanbul trip was his idea. He framed it as a gift. Dad, you've never been to Turkey? I'm going for a conference. Come with me. We'll spend a few extra days. My treat. I should have known. My son had never done anything purely as a gift. Every gesture came with weight attached, invisible until the moment he chose to drop it on you. But I went. Because he was my son. Because I missed the version of him that used to exist. Because I thought maybe a week in a foreign city could rebuild something that had been slowly collapsing for years. I was wrong about that too. The first 3 days were fine. Surface level fine. We ate well, walked through the Grand Bazaar, took a boat along the Bosphorus. Kofi was on his phone constantly, which I had come to accept as his baseline state. We didn't talk deeply. We didn't argue. We coexisted in the pleasant, hollow way that people do when they're performing a relationship rather than having one. Then, on the 4th night, he told me about the change of plans. We were at dinner. He set his phone face down on the table, which meant he was about to say something he didn't want interrupted, and he told me that his return flight was being moved up. His company needed him back in London 2 days early. He'd already rebooked his ticket. What about mine? I asked. He looked at me with an expression I recognized. It was the expression he wore when he had already decided something and was only now getting around to informing me. Your original ticket still stands, Dad. You'll just be here a couple more days on your own. It's Istanbul. You'll be fine. I pointed out, calmly, that my original ticket was in his name, booked through his company account, and that I had no access to change it, cancel it, or even confirm it at the airline desk without his account credentials. He blinked. I'll sort it before I leave. He did not sort it before he left. The morning of his departure, I woke up at 6 to find a note on the hotel breakfast table that said he'd had an early car arranged, didn't want to wake me, and that he'd sent the airline information to my email. He left me the equivalent of €60 in Turkish lira, which, after I paid the remaining hotel balance he had quietly removed himself from, left me with just over $40 to my name in a country where I had no data plan, no local SIM card, and no functional way to access my own accounts without Wi-Fi. He had not sorted the ticket. When I finally got into my email at the hotel lobby before checkout, what I found was a forward of his booking confirmation. Not mine. His. He had sent me his own itinerary. Whether that was carelessness or something colder, I still don't know. What I know is that when I arrived at the airport that morning, there was no ticket in my name on any system the airline agent could find. I stood at that desk for 40 minutes. The agent was patient and kind. She tried every variation of my name, my passport number, my date of birth. Nothing. The booking Kofi had made had either been cancelled, transferred, or had simply never included me as a passenger in the first place. I called him. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I called again. Voicemail. I sent a text explaining the situation in plain, factual sentences. No panic. No accusation. Just the facts. He read it. I watched the 2 blue ticks appear. He did not respond. That was the moment I understood that this was not an accident. This was not carelessness. My son had intentionally left me stranded in Istanbul with no functioning ticket, minimal cash, and the quiet expectation that I would either figure it out or call someone for help in a way that would embarrass me enough to make me compliant for years to come. He knew how proud I was. He had calculated that humiliation would keep me quiet. He had no idea that I had already been sitting in a lounge chair for the past 2 hours next to a woman named Adiz Nwosu. I need to stop here. Because Adiz is the part of this story that my son will never fully recover from understanding. I had arrived at the airport 4 hours before my supposed departure, a habit from decades of international travel for engineering projects. I'd taken a seat in one of the open seating areas near the International Departures Hall, ordered coffee from a nearby kiosk, and opened a newspaper. Old habits. The woman who sat down 2 chairs away from me did so with the practiced ease of someone who spent an extraordinary amount of time in airports, and had long since stopped being impressed by any of them. She was perhaps 50, elegantly dressed without being ostentatious, carrying a slim leather portfolio and speaking quietly into her phone in a language I eventually identified as a mix of English, French, and Igbo. She ended her call, caught me glancing over, and said, in perfectly accented English, "Sorry. I know that was a lot." I told her it wasn't a problem. She asked if I was flying out. I told her I believed so. She raised an eyebrow at the word "believed," and I gave her the abbreviated version of my situation: ticket confusion, son's early departure, minor administrative chaos. She listened without the performance of sympathy. Just listened. Then she said, "Let me ask you something. Are you actually fine, or are you doing that thing men of our generation do where we say we're fine because admitting otherwise feels like defeat?" I laughed. It was the most genuine laugh I'd had in 4 days. Her name was Adiz Nwosu. She was a Lagos-born businesswoman based in Geneva. She owned a logistics and infrastructure consultancy that operated across 14 countries. She had a net worth, which I would only learn later, that placed her comfortably in the category of people who do not look at menus for prices. We talked for 2 hours. About engineering, which she had studied before pivoting to business. About infrastructure development in West Africa, which she was actively involved in. About what it meant to build things that outlasted you, bridges, companies, families. That last word landed between us with a particular weight. When I finally went to the airline desk and discovered the full scope of what Kofi had left me with, I returned to the seating area to collect my bag and think clearly about next steps. I had enough in my accessible bank account, once I found Wi-Fi and got through to my bank's international line, to book a new economy seat, though the next available direct flight wasn't until the following morning. I would need a hotel for the night. The math was uncomfortable but manageable. What I did not expect was Adiz still being there. She looked up from her portfolio and read my face immediately. "Worse than you thought?" I told her the summary. No ticket. No son answering the phone. One night to sort out in a city where I now had no hotel. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said something I will remember for the rest of my life. "I need a small favor. I have a business dinner tonight with 3 men who will spend the entire evening trying to renegotiate what I've already agreed to in writing, because they believe a woman dining alone is easier to pressure than a woman accompanied. I don't need a bodyguard. I don't need a lawyer. I just need someone at that table who looks like he's heard every version of that game before and isn't moved by any of it." She paused. "You look exactly like that man. Come to dinner with me." I'll handle your hotel. You don't owe me anything after tonight. I asked her why she trusted me, a stranger she'd met 2 hours ago in an airport. She said, because you've been sitting alone in an international terminal for 4 hours without once looking at your phone for comfort. That tells me either you're in serious trouble and hiding it very well, or you're someone who is genuinely comfortable with himself. Either way, you're interesting. I said yes. What followed was one of the most extraordinary evenings of my post-retirement life. The dinner was at a private room in a hotel in Besiktas, the kind of place that doesn't advertise because it doesn't need to. 3 men, all representing a consortium looking to renegotiate the terms of a contract Adi's company had with a Ghanaian port authority. They were polished, well-prepared, and utterly convinced that they held the leverage. They had not expected me. I said very little during the first hour. I didn't need to. My presence alone shifted the room in a way I could feel. When one of the men began citing infrastructure cost projections that I knew, from 3 decades of experience, were inflated by at least 30%, I set down my glass and asked him, very politely, which estimation model he was using, because the numbers didn't reconcile with current regional material costs, and I'd be happy to walk through the discrepancy if it would help move things forward. The table went quiet. Adiz looked at me with an expression that was almost imperceptible to anyone who didn't know what to look for. A micro smile. Controlled. Satisfied. The meeting ended with the consortium agreeing to honor the original contract terms. Afterward, in the car back to the hotel, Adiz asked me how long I'd been retired. I told her 3 years. She asked if I missed it. I told her that was a complicated question. She asked if I'd be open to something less complicated. I told her I was listening. That night, she outlined a consulting arrangement. A short-term engagement reviewing infrastructure proposals submitted to her company's East and West African portfolio, flagging technical overstatements, identifying misrepresented cost structures, and providing sign-off on engineering credibility before her legal team moved forward on contracts. 6 proposals to start. Paid per review. The figure she named per review was more than my monthly pension. I asked her if this was charity wearing a different suit. She said, Gerald, you saved me $2.4 million tonight by asking one question. This is not charity. This is what I owe you, and I'm still getting the better end of this arrangement. I started the following month. Now let me tell you what was happening with Kofi while all of this was unfolding. He had arrived back in London fully expecting, I believe, a distressed phone call from me within 24 hours. The kind of call that would give him the upper hand. The kind where I would have to ask him for help, and he could provide it on his terms, from a position of control. That call would have reset the power between us in a way that benefited him. I would have owed him. I would have been grateful. I would have been, in his mind, finally manageable. The call never came. What came instead, 48 hours after he left me on that curb, was a single text from me. It read, "Sorted everything. Home safe. We'll talk when the time is right." Nothing else. He responded 11 minutes later. "Glad to hear it. Sorry about the confusion with the ticket." Confusion. That was the word he chose. I did not respond to that. Over the following 3 weeks, I received increasingly frequent messages from Kofi. First, casually worded check-ins. Then questions about whether I was free to talk. Then a voicemail. His first voicemail to me in over a year, asking if I was alright, because he hadn't heard from me properly and was starting to worry. Worry. From the man who had driven away from me in a foreign country without looking back. I let him worry. What Kofi didn't know, what he couldn't have known, because he had stopped paying attention to me years ago, was that my life had been quietly extraordinary in ways he had never bothered to investigate. He didn't know about the engineering work I'd continued doing informally after retirement. The colleagues who still called me for second opinions. The contacts I had accumulated across 4 continents over 3 decades of building things that held. He had categorized me as old and obsolete because that was simpler than acknowledging that his father had a life and a mind that continued functioning well beyond his usefulness to Kofi's personal narrative. He also didn't know about a conversation I had had with my solicitor 18 months earlier, shortly after a particularly ugly incident at his home in which Kofi had spoken to me in front of his friends in a way that I will not recount here in detail, but which had made clear that his disrespect was no longer private. It had become performative. After that evening, I had sat down with my solicitor and restructured several things. Not out of anger. Out of clarity. My will, which had previously divided my estate in a straightforward way between Kofi and a charitable trust one support, was revised. The house, fully owned, valued at that point at just over £800,000, was placed into a trust with specific conditions of distribution. Several investment accounts were restructured. A letter was drafted, not threatening, simply factual, that outlined the terms under which the estate would be released, and the conditions under which those terms could change. My solicitor had asked me, gently, whether I was certain. I told her I had never been more certain of anything. I did not tell Kofi any of this. By the time he started calling me daily, which happened approximately 6 weeks after Istanbul, I had already completed my first 2 consulting reviews for Adi's company, had been introduced through her to 2 other firms seeking similar technical oversight, and had quietly accepted a part-time advisory position with an infrastructure NGO operating in Ghana and Senegal. My life was not contracting. It was expanding. Rapidly. In directions my son had never imagined possible because he had stopped imagining me as a person who moved through the world. The call that changed everything between Kofi and me came on a Tuesday evening in October. He had apparently spoken to my sister, Afia, who lives in Accra and who knew, because I had told her, because she asked and because she actually listens, that I was doing well. Better than well. That I had connected with someone professionally in Istanbul. That I was traveling again, working again, alive again in the way I hadn't been since I retired. Afia, to her credit, had said very little. But she had said enough. When Kofi called that Tuesday, his voice was different. The casual authority he usually carried was gone. In its place was something I had never heard from him in adulthood. Uncertainty. He asked how I was. I told him I was well. He asked what I was working on. I told him I'd taken on some consulting work, nothing too demanding, interesting projects. He asked with whom. I told him the name of Adi's company. Silence on the line. Not long. Maybe 4 seconds. But 4 seconds is a significant silence in a phone call between 2 people who know each other well. He knew the name. Of course he did. Kofi worked in international trade finance. Adi's company was not obscure in those circles. It was respected, well capitalized, and connected to some of the most substantial infrastructure development deals on the continent. He said very carefully, "How did you come to be working with them?" I told him we met in Istanbul. Another silence. In Istanbul, he repeated. Yes, I said. While I was sorting out the ticket situation. I let that sit. Then I asked him if he had anything he wanted to say to me. Not about the consulting. About Istanbul. About the note on the breakfast table. About the 2 blue ticks on the message he had read and not answered while I stood at an airline desk in a foreign country. What followed was the longest and most uncomfortable conversation we have had in my 61 years of knowing my son. He did not deny anything. He tried, at first, to soften the framing. The word confusion made another appearance, but I was not interested in softened framing. I asked him direct questions and I waited quietly for direct answers. By the end of it, he was not the man who had driven away from me without looking back. He was something smaller. Not because I had punished him. Because the truth of what he had done, held up in plain light with no softening available, was simply smaller than he could carry comfortably. He apologized. Whether that apology was genuine or strategic, I have not yet fully determined. I suspect it contained elements of both. I told him I accepted it. Because I did, on the level where acceptance matters. The level where you stop carrying the weight of someone else's actions inside your own chest. What I did not tell him is that accepting an apology and restoring trust are 2 entirely separate actions, and that one does not automatically produce the other. I also did not tell him about the will. He would learn about that in time. Not as a punishment. I want to be clear about that. The restructuring of my estate was never about punishing Kofi. It was about aligning my resources with the truth of who shows up, who pays attention, and who treats me as a person rather than a problem to be managed. That truth had become clearer to me, not because of Istanbul alone, but because Istanbul had been the moment I finally stopped explaining it away. The charitable trust, which supports engineering education for young people in Ghana, will now receive the majority. Kofi will receive a portion, because he is my son and I am not a man who operates from spite. But the house, the primary asset, the thing he had always quietly assumed would be his, that is spoken for elsewhere, and has been for 18 months. He will find out when he needs to know. Not before. In the meantime, I have a life that is fuller than it has been in years. I have work that uses my actual mind. I have a colleague, Adiz, who I now speak with weekly and have visited twice, once in Geneva and once in Accra, who treats my experience as an asset rather than an anachronism. I have my sister, who calls every Sunday and who cried quietly when I told her the full story of Istanbul. I have my home, my garden, my books, and my pension, none of which ever required Kofi's permission to exist. And I have the memory of standing on that curb outside Istanbul Ataturk Airport with $43 and a carry-on bag, watching my son's car disappear into traffic, and choosing, in that moment, not to collapse. Not to beg. Not to make the call that would have handed him exactly what he wanted. I bought a coffee. I found a seat. I opened a newspaper. And everything that came after came because I was still, in spite of everything he believed about me, exactly who I had always been. My son thought he was leaving behind a man with no options. He left behind a man who hadn't needed his options in 30 years. He just hadn't been paying enough attention to notice.